and then I'll pass over to Mark to talk about microgrids. As a business, we have a philosophy about creating communities. Communities is one of our core values and something we strive to do. And the approach that I try and take to smart cities very much embodies that. So there's a lot of technology that exists, right? You hear about new products, new services, things every day that you could apply to a project. What we find the most challenging though, is if you just go and do that, you end up with something highly technical, highly complex, you've spent a lot of money on it, and it may not necessarily do what your client wants it to. So we constantly look at what are the benefits of smart city technologies, what are the benefits of any technology. And that helps us, I guess, establish our mission or what we aim to do when we create smart cities. And that's really about creating a city that puts people first. It's about using the technology to connect people, connect them with the place they're at, and also provide, I guess, an ecosystem that means the technology doesn't feel like it's just a product someone's found on Google and applied to their project. It actually has some real benefits to creating efficiency. It might be sustainability. It might be just helping people do what they do every day. So when I think about a smart city and what makes smart cities important, these are the things I think about. I think about creating a healthier and happier community, making the best use of space. You might have some unique site constraints. You might want to use the data that you collect from people who visit to make sure that they have a better experience next time they come. You want to attract and retain top businesses if you're a city, or if you're if your smart community is very people focused, you want people who come there to live for the long term. You want people to be able to interact with the public realm and use everything that the community that you provide has to offer. You want people to know it's there. You want safety and health, right? Like we see technology being applied every day now to help people who maybe later in life deal with some of the challenges they experience. And I guess all of it for us is about creating a community that's resilient, sustainable, reliable, and affordable. If you can't do any of these, if you can't do all of those things, it's potentially not worth doing or using the technology that you're thinking about applying. So that's what the term smart city means to me. And I encourage everybody to kind of try and think that way. Don't think straight about that's a cool piece of technology. Think about what the benefits it could provide to your client or the users or the ultimate people who will live in that community and enjoy it. And that's really important, because once you establish those goals, you can then apply the right technology and the appropriate technology in order to deliver those outcomes. So now I'm going to kind of change tact and talk about some of the things that we've done before. And to my earlier points that I've made, just talk about why we've done them. So an example is, right, that you might be coming to a new community or a new city that you've never been to before. You know where you want to go, but you don't know where the closest parking space is. Once you're out of the car, you don't know how to get there. We see a lot happening now with smart parking, so showing you to the nearest bay that's available, and also using that technology to guide you so that you park near where you want to go, but also have some signage or digital signage that can tell you a bit more about where you're trying to go to help you get there. And that's, for me, about improving people's experience. Another one that's really important for improving experiences, we often provide free public Wi-Fi in public places. And I hope I'm not, sort of scaring people with this, but often that data is used to actually count the number of people who visit that space, to help the people who manage that space understand who's new, who's returning, how long they stayed, where they went while they were there. And that's all about being able to improve the services that are provided in that city or community to best traffic that's using it. We do this in lots of ways. We don't just use Wi-Fi, there's the sensors, the people on footpaths. So that's I guess a real world application of a technology that you may have just thought was free public Wi-Fi. There's a real focus at the moment on intelligent transport, and really that's about not necessarily making people's commute or movement through a city faster, but it's about making that commute consistent. And it's about trying to not inconvenience people who do the right thing. We've worked on a project recently that has speed-dependent speed bumps. The speed bumps only pop up if you're over the speed limit. So why inconvenience everybody if you can just inconvenience those who are not doing the right thing? We're now trialling some intersections here in WA as a project we're doing with main roads, where we've actually got pedestrian sensors on the traffic lights. So if people walk past and hit the button, is there actually someone standing there? And if that person is faster at crossing the road, let's get the green light on faster. If that person is slower crossing the road because they might be elderly, just give them a little bit more time so they don't feel stressed. And these technologies have been around for a while, and it just takes a need or a problem that you're trying to solve to use them. And I nearly guarantee you there's a product available out there. When I talked about making communities safer, something that we're seeing more of now is things like communities may have security or security guards and things like that try and help people feel safe, and having help points gives people that sense that they're, if something goes wrong, there's someone there for them. We also use other technologies now like CCTV, where we're able to do analytics of the image that we're receiving from the camera to work out whether there's people loitering or a crowd of protesters forming. The next step on some of these technologies is actually detecting antisocial behaviour just by looking at analysing the image and feed that's coming through from a CCTV camera. Something that's becoming more and more common is technologies that help the actual city maintenance people better manage that city. So things like smart bins seems like a kind of a strange concept, right? But these bins internally have a compactor that crushes the waste that's in them, which extends the time between when they need to be emptied. The second thing that they do is actually report when they need to be emptied. So rather than just empty the bins every day just because, you can actually have a much better workflow for your people who are managing that city, allowing them just to empty the bins that are full. This same technology is being applied at the moment in several new housing subdivisions and councils for domestic bins. The area that I live in has an actual RFID chip that's in my bin that helps the council analyse what people in my area are sending to waste and in what volume. And with that improved management comes the need to be able to access this technology. And we're seeing more and more councils equip their personnel with things like Surface Pros and iPads, where we can collate all of the information from all of these different systems, CCTV, bins, help points, and give the people walking around the ability to see what's going on. And we've gone in an example of a project we've done here in WA, where we've got a authority who's quite short-staffed. We've actually set up an arrangement where the person who is closest to an incident or something that happens gets the alert first. So people can be all walking around, tending to their particular area. If you're out in the beach and there's an incident in the city, you don't necessarily want to be bothering the person that's closest to the beach to go and empty a bin. So we manage the actual alerts that move around the system to allocate those tasks to people who are closest. And we use the system to workflow those tasks and track how quickly the person responded to them, which helps the council, really keep on top of making sure that things happen in a timely manner. And I kind of want to, one of the other key purposes I think about smart cities is being able to future-proof your city. There's a couple of quotes here that came from an article I assisted recently with a property council. And we build buildings and communities with a lot of parking. And potentially the actual value of parking spaces in buildings will always be there, right? I think whether it's someone parking their car there today or an autonomous taxi parking itself there to wait between trips in the future, the value of parking space is always high, but parking that's on the street and access to the curb in a planning context, I believe, is becoming really important. A single, 2-hour car bay doesn't provide a lot of benefit in terms of delivering people in and out of a city or in and out of a building. But if you convert all those curbside car bays to rideshare drop-off, you can deliver, and I've got the statistic on the screen there, an eye-watering nearly 2,000 people via that single car space within an hour, based on a relatively standard drop-off time. Interesting things that come up, right? Like, obviously, we're seeing more and more practical applications of drones. All of a sudden, will roof space on buildings become, a lettable area that landlords can lease and actually command a higher value for? At the moment, we typically use them for a whole lot of building plant and services, which makes them, not good for a whole lot of other things. But obviously, the drone doesn't mind how noisy it is or that plant's up there. So it's about essentially potentially an opportunity for people who own buildings to lease that space. Electric vehicle charging in terms of future-proofing is probably the #1 smart city technology we find out there at the moment. There's smart chargers now that have the ability to swipe your credit card, tap and go to recharge your car, and we see car charging technologies getting faster and more efficient all the time. These infrastructures create a considerable burden on cities. They're often, the example in the photo here is a project we did in Canada for Tesla, where we rolled out Tesla chargers to 100 sites across Canada. And they place an incredible demand on the electricity infrastructure. And that's something that Mark, we'll talk about with microgrids and some of the emerging technologies in that space. And I guess to wrap up some of what I'm talking about in terms of smart cities, one of the things that's really important to me is making sure that everything we build is sustainable. We don't want technology that's just going to be thrown in the bin in 5 years because nobody uses it. And that's another good reason to make sure there's a true purpose to what you're doing in the smart city space. But also because these smart city technologies should give you the opportunity to decrease waste, to make systems more efficient, to reduce operational costs for managing a city. And one example of that in a very much community context is the ability to actually provision a community with the services that it requires in a manner that allows that community to share those services. And a pretty hot topic at the moment around that is this concept of community title and the ability to be able to share and exchange electricity and other services amongst your immediate neighbours. So I might hand over at this point to Mark Price to talk more about microgrids and sustainable electricity infrastructure.
Thanks, Elliot. All right, so what is a microgrid? So essentially a microgrid is some decentralized energy assets. So historically, the electrical system has worked with, we've got a generator at some faraway point, we've got a transmission and distribution system, and then we'll ultimately finish off with an electrical load, somewhere for that energy to go. Now, in the last 10 years, certainly in terms of major growth, we're seeing a decentralization of the energy industry. People want to be able to generate their own power. People want local reliability. People want to be able to store their own power. And as Elliot mentioned before, when we're looking at a microgrid, we're essentially creating an energy community, and it's our own little energy supply authority within our own community. Now, that isn't to be confused with a standalone power system or a remote power system, because if we've got the ability to connect to the grid is a wonderful resource. So essentially the definition of a microgrid is we've decentralized some assets. We've got our own solar PV and wind and battery storage and those sorts of technologies. We've deployed them. And typically another key indicator of a microgrid is that it has the ability to disconnect from the grid if it needs to do so. So the ability to operate in island mode is what that's called. So how do we connect smart cities and microgrids together? Well, what we're seeing is quite a large shift in the traditional energy sources, all moving towards electrification. So we're not so much using natural gas anymore in apartment buildings or even in homes. There's been studies that if we electrify there's some savings in the long term versus the short term of gas. Gas had a strong string in its bow for cooking. People only want to cook gas, but now with induction cooking, we're certainly seeing that shift to full electrification on most projects. So when we create our electrical microgrid, we're doing two things, I suppose. We're getting the community involved in terms of constructing the electrical infrastructure. We're distributing that amongst the community, and then we're delivering it closer to the source. So it's actually much more efficient. So we don't have huge amounts of transmission and distribution losses. We're able to deliver it immediately to the load that requires it. Now, and in this building here, for example, it's going to generate its own electricity. It's going to use air source heat pumps to generate heat for its hot water. But in a microgrid, when you cross those regulatory hurdles that Elliot mentioned earlier with respect to community titling and things like that, there's possibility to share energy with your neighbor. And that neighbor may not have to pay for that energy as if it's come from a power station 100 kilometers away. So we do want to create communities that are engaged with the energy and the microgrid that serves it, rather than create self-sustained silo buildings. We want to be able to share amongst each other, all work together for a common goal. So I mentioned the grid here. Now, I don't work for a network supply authority, but I am a big fan of the electrical grid. I think it's very necessary. I think we need it. I think for sustainability purposes, it's a wonderful thing. And the first thing that I get asked on the majority of projects in an initial feasibility stage is, we want to be off grid. We want batteries, we want solar. We don't want the grid. We've had enough of the grid. Well, the grid gives us the ability to share energy that we don't consume ourselves. So in that scenario, you typically have to over-generate hundreds of kilowatt, if not thousands of kilowatt hours of solar PV that just gets dissipated as heat, and it doesn't get shared amongst the community. So it's anti-sustainable, and it's a siloed approach. So having the grid, it's an excellent community resource. It facilitates us sharing this energy with our close neighbors, and it allows for something that's really going to take off in the next few years, and that's virtual power plants. Now, having multiple microgrids distributed across the country, what's really great about the fact that we're all interconnected now with data is that we can aggregate these virtual power plants, these solar assets, these batteries, and we can call upon them to operate in unison to solve major problems that we have on the network. And so we've major problems with oversupply of solar. We've made major problems with network stability. And rather than building a new power station to solve those problems, if we're able to all come together and work as an aggregator, we can solve those problems. So the next slide. Okay, so the key challenges with microgrids and renewables, and I understand that the project that we're looking at here doesn't have the luxury of connecting to the grid, but these are the challenges that these projects face when they're standalone. So there's an intermittency of renewables. So solar PV will generate when there's sun in the sky, but it's not going to generate as much when there's clouds in the sky or when it's nighttime. So we have to run analyses where we overlay weather files and historical load profiles, and we try and work out how we match the renewable generation sources with the requirements of the electrical load that we're trying to service. Now, if we don't have that availability, what we end up having to do is significantly oversize our renewables in order to make sure that we've got enough stored in the battery to last us through a period where we might not have the resources available. We might have a quiet wind day, or we might have a stormy season where we need to work on a 5-day sort of storage arrangement. The next big challenge is when we talked about the electrification of building services, but the electrification of electric vehicles is something that we're just not sure how that's going to impact on the distribution system yet. We don't know whether people are going to charge their cars simultaneously. We can put controls in place to limit that occurring. But we have to think of the end consumer as well. You know, if you're plugging your mobile phone into the wall and there's no energy there to deliver to it, you're not going to be super happy. As a consumer, we're quite demanding, I suppose. There is regulatory issues which have been put in place to protect us as consumers, as electricity consumers, to make sure that that we're looked after, but they are slow to move with the times. So as we have this ability to generate local energy and share it, we don't have a mechanism in place that easily allows for that trading to occur. And so when we're creating a microgrid, we've got these distributed assets that we have to look after. We have to I suppose manage and maintain, and we need to make sure that it's robust and reliable. So the mobile phone you plug into the wall gets charged, and then that's often one of the biggest challenges when creating a microgrid within a community, is to work out who's going to own it. How are we going to do the deal? Is it going to be a community-driven solution where everybody pays the equivalent of strata fees to manage and maintain it, or are we just going to go to a one-stop shop to deliver that for us and just sell us the energy? So there are probably two ends of the spectrum where you've got a low level of community engagement and a very high level of community engagement, and that's they're really the main challenges. So yeah, to design a microgrid, the first thing one needs to do is to establish what we're going to work with. And when we establish a community electrical load profile and we look at a microgrid as a whole, we get much more benefits than we do if we look at an individual building as a whole, because you'll have complementary load profiles. So you've got a hotel, or you've got an apartment building, or a school, or an office block. They all use power very different to each other. And when you put them together into the mix, that helps you design your renewables to suit a more I suppose, reliable and flattened load profile, rather than a very jumpy, erratic load profile that's really hard to design to. So it includes both centralized and decentralized energy. And when we say centralized, we kind of mean within the microgrid, rather than 100 kilometers from the site. So if we can have a community battery sitting in the park, and we can have solar PV on people's roofs, then that's kind of the decentralization and the centralization, all within the one microgrid sphere. And it's how we allow people to have their own solar power while still participating in a microgrid. Can they trade with their neighbors, or does that sit in front of the meter or after the meter? All these challenges that we have to go through. So, and another thing on the electrical load profiles is that's when we look at the stability of a microgrid, there's two ways to solve it. One is to have more renewables and more battery storage to make us more robust. Or we also have the option where we could look at the other side of the coin, which is, do we really need to be consuming energy right now in this period when we're struggling, in this period where we've got no wind or we've got no solar radiation? And allowing for, we've been installing HVAC systems, so aircon systems in buildings for years that have the ability to be controlled centrally by a network controller. Now, we have never taken advantage of that ability, but that's more so because as a consumer, do you really want the microgrid operator to be telling you when you can and can't cool your home? So we can do that with electric vehicle chargers. We could do it with HVAC systems, but we could also do it with the curtailment of your PV on your house. So you've got a solar PV on your house. We can also talk to that and say, we might not need so much energy right now. Can you cool the jets? So without a grid connection on the project that we're talking about, we can't purchase something that's called green power. That's more of a grid connected initiative. And the virtual power plant also, because we're not interconnected with a grid, we can't offer our services to an aggregator where we can pool our resources and help stabilize the grid. So that's microgrids.
I've just dropped in here a couple of examples of projects that we've done before, and an example that we did in Canada as a business was looking at the development of a new sort of downtown area of Canada in Toronto. And I guess we'll provide a copy of these slides, but we've overlaid it with some of the smart technologies that we applied here. And that includes, this is a pretty significant development, right? And unfortunately, the funding for the project hasn't necessarily gone ahead, so it's on hold at the moment. But basically, it demonstrates how these concepts can be applied at a city block scale. Obviously, that's, from the perspective of this project, we're doing something much smaller. But another example is really Atlanta, Georgia, are looking at how they future-proof their city for autonomous vehicles. So that puts a lot of emphasis on things like line marking, how you avoid, sort of some of the traditional challenges that you have associated with vehicles, and having that space for drop-off, having the ability to combine cycling traffic with pedestrian traffic with vehicles on the same space. And an example that Mark's looking at is actually an example of a virtual power plant.
Yeah, so we're working with the state-owned electricity retailer here in WA to roll out a whole heap of Tesla battery storage. I realize now we've plugged Tesla twice in this presentation, but they're highly marketable brand, I suppose. So we are putting Tesla batteries throughout the network that will operate in unison and support the grid.